and welcome to my book channel. I'm Zen Liu, and today I'm wrapping up all of the books that I've read in August. So this month I've enjoyed some books from the 2025 Hugo Award Best Novel finalists, the 2025 Booker Prize Longlist, and also some other sci-fi fantasy finds. Let's get started right away with my favorites. Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell. Not only is this my favorite book among the 2025 Hugo Best Novel finalists, this is so far my best read of 2025. So this book follows Qiufan, who is a cannibalistic shapeshifter who eats people and can turn her victims' body parts into her own body parts. And she can do this with other objects as well. For example, she can turn a bear trap into a heart or a table leg into a shin bone. One day while she was hibernating, just taking a nap, minding her own business, 3 hunters intruded upon her lair, and the leader of which was wearing an entirely gold set of armor. So it was highly impractical, but he did look very shiny. And he shot her with a crossbow bolt that was coated in rosemary oil. So this unfortunately poisoned Qiufan, and then she had to sneak into town to try to find some sustenance and maybe get this poisoned arrow out of her. And a very kind-hearted woman called Homily saved her. So Homily is very chubby and adorable. She has brown eyes and she wears this green knitted scarf, and she also loves books. So then they became fast friends, and their relationship gradually developed. But then Qiufan found out that Homily was actually searching for a shapeshifter who allegedly cursed her family. And Qiufan realized that eating her girlfriend was not an option, so she must help her solve this mystery in some other way. This book really is as funny as it sounds, and it's also a great satire of power and the abuse of power, and the author also explores the subject of abuse in a very meaningful manner, specifically how abuse can be a vicious cycle, and the people who are abused would turn into abusers, and how that would just continue on. And the characterization is also very well done. Qiufan is pretty much the most lovable monster, and just one of the most lovable characters I had ever read. In addition to her girlfriend Homily, she also has this pet bear who has blue fur, and she named the bear Blueberry, so she is very fiercely protective of her bear and her girlfriend. And I find myself just rooting for her every step of the way, even when she's planning murder and destruction in order to save the people that she truly loves. And the way that this author blended humor and satire together really reminded me of Sir Terry Pratchett in the best way possible. So for example, in this book there are 3 highwaymen. They're called aristocracy, plutocracy, and kleptocracy. They pretty much rob people in broad daylight, and they call themselves a toll station. There are many elements in this book like that where it is laugh out loud funny, but afterwards when you think about it, there's a really poignant message behind it, and it makes a great social commentary. The author also paced this story in a way that's engaging and addictive, and there are twists and turns at every corner, and the mystery keeps deepening and the conflicts keep escalating, and you just cannot put this book down. And also it's just a really fun ride. So unfortunately, this book did not win the 2025 Hugo, although it is a winner in my eyes, and among the 6 finalists, I think if you are going to pick up one, I really hope it is this one. I know this book is not recommended or discussed very often on social media. I have not seen any of the book reviewers that I follow talk about this book, so if this is the first time that you're hearing about this book, I highly recommend you pick up a copy. This is going to be one of the most enjoyable books that you have read for a very long time. Another of my favorites from August is Waste Tide by Qiufan. This is a science fiction originally published in 2013 and translated in 2019 by the one and only Ken Liu. This story is set on Silicon Isle, which is a fictional place in the southernmost parts of China. And this place is a technological dump site. So it's not simply a trash processing facility. This is where a lot of international technological waste are shipped there by containers. The beginning of the story cites the Basel Convention, which restricts the dumping of toxic waste from developed countries to developing countries. However, the United States is not a ratified member of the Basel Convention. And in this story, there is a discarded military mecha that originated from the American defense contractor Lockheed Martin that will become quite central to the story later on. So not only are the people of Silicon Isle overwhelmed by the sheer amount of technological garbage that's dumped upon them by more economically developed superpowers of the world, they also find that processing trash is sometimes their only way of making a living. So people would try to salvage parts from not properly decommissioned robots, a lot of the times getting injured, or try to dip computing parts in acid bath to retrieve heavy metal without proper protective gear. And a lot of the people doing this dangerous trash processing work are migrant workers, and they are looked down upon by the locals of Silicon Isle. And they're kind of on the bottom of the food chain in this place. And the waste processing business is tightly controlled by 3 local clans who are kind of like warring mafia families, and they absolutely don't shy away from violence. Silicon Isle is also a restrictive bitrate zone, so the residents here have a limited access to data and information. I hope I've told you enough to help you see the complexity and the compelling nature of the world building in this story. Not only is there a lot of power struggle and wealth imbalance on a personal and local level, there is power imbalance on an international level. Not only are American corporations dumping trash on less fortunate regions, they also try to profit from said trash by trying to install American-owned recycling business onto Silicon Isle and try to gain access to local resources. This book also touches on the clash between technological advances and very traditional cultures. On the one hand, people just replace their body parts with prosthetics wherever they see fit, and on the other hand, they also value things like traditional tea ceremonies and kind of shamanistic supernatural beliefs. This would be a fantastic read for anyone who enjoys cyberpunk and transhumanism subjects, and also the issue of ecological and environmental impact of consumerism and consumer waste, anyone who is interested in global politics and economic inequality, and also anyone who enjoys an imaginative story that gives you a glimpse into a foreign culture. This book is one of my best thrifting finds ever, and it's definitely a strong contender for my favorite book of 2025. There Are Rivers in the Sky by Elif Shafak is another one of my favorites this month. This story follows 3 different characters from 3 different place and time, and they're all connected together by water. Arthur Smith was born in Victorian England by the River Thames. He was born under very unfortunate circumstances, but local toshers intervenes. So toshers were the lower class people that used to scavenge in the sewers during Victorian era, looking for any valuables and making a very difficult living. And they really took pity on this little boy, and they named him King Arthur of the Sewers and Slums. So Arthur had a very difficult start to his life, and he witnessed some of the most transitional times in British history and also in the history of the River Thames. For example, the Great Stink and the cholera epidemic. And later, while working in a publishing house, he learned of the Epic of Gilgamesh and developed an interest in King Ashurbanipal and his great library, and also just the Yazidi history and culture in general. The Yazidi are a very misunderstood people group, and they faced a lot of prejudice and violence due to their religion, and they're often called devil worshippers. So Naren, the young Turkish girl in this story, is one of the Yazidi, and she was supposed to have a baptism by the river Tigris, but it was interrupted by bulldozers, who are workers working on building the Ilisu Dam. So the Ilisu Dam was a project that faced a lot of criticism for its impact on the environment and also impact on the preservation of history, because it disturbed a lot of historical sites that contained relics from the Mesopotamian culture. And the third character, Zelika, is a hydrologist trying to rent a houseboat on the River Thames. So the section that used to be the sewers and slums back in Arthur's day are now cleaned up and kind of reserved and monopolized by the rich and powerful. And Zelika is someone who studies water, and also her family has Yazidi heritage. So she was raised by an uncle who was very well-to-do, but despite all of his success, he was viewed as kind of a perpetual foreigner in Britain. These 3 characters are very seamlessly linked by their connection to the Yazidi culture and their fascination for the Epic of Gilgamesh, and also just the cyclical nature of water. This story does this very romantic exploration of water, of how it can evaporate and become rain, and then fall back down and enter the drinking water system, be consumed by people, turn into tears, and then fall into the sink, and goes goes back into the water supply, and the cycle repeats again. And because of this, water is something that carries cultural memory and transcends space and time and connects people's lives together. This story has some of the most absorbing and transporting writing that I have ever experienced. So I typically listen to audiobook when I'm walking my dog, and I'm like taking my dog by the leash, trying to prevent her from running into the street, and also there's traffic noise happening all around. But while I was listening to this book, it's like I wasn't even processing my physical environment. My brain was like just in Victorian England, or like on the side of the River Thames inside a houseboat where a dinner party is happening. I feel like I was transported to Victorian England, or like a small village in Iraq, or like a houseboat on the River Thames. It's just incredible. And I'm definitely going to buy a physical copy of this book and keep it in my collection. And also, this book just makes me want to read more on every subject that this author has mentioned. I definitely want to read the Epic of Gilgamesh at some point, and also I would love to read more about just the cleaning up of the Thames River, how that actually happened, like what caused all of the pollution, and maybe just some books on the pollution of water and the prevention of it, because when you really think about it, all the water supply of the world are somewhat connected, and any kind of toxins that we put into the environment and gets into the water, it affects all human beings everywhere. So needless to say, this book has fantastic characterization, a very gripping and absorbing narrative, and also it just inspires me to read more. It was an amazing read and one of my favorites of the year. Audition by Katie Kitamura. Of the 2025 Booker Prize longlisted books I've read so far, this one is my favorite. So in this story, the protagonist is a successful theater actress in New York City, and she is currently rehearsing for an upcoming play, and she was meeting a much younger man at a restaurant. As they're sitting down at the table, she became very aware of what this might look like to everyone around her, and the perception and the assumption that they might be making about the relationship between them. And at this moment, her husband also walked into the restaurant. So throughout this story, the relationship between these three took on quite a few unexpected turns, and this story is very deeply psychological, and it's also a very good piece of flow of consciousness writing. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed this story. So I don't typically read books that are just about relationships or just about marriage. I like a little more expansive world building or mystery or drama or just something more going on. But I have heard of this author for quite a long time, and I really wanted to give this book a try, and I was not disappointed. I find her writing to be very easily absorbing. I really enjoyed her writing style. I think she has a great command of the flow of consciousness style in a way that's very reminiscent of Virginia Woolf. I think I had a similar impression reading Mrs. Dalloway, in which the sentences just flow together really well, and there's this real sense of rhythm to it. And you feel like you're inside the mind of another person, and you're seeing the world through their eyes, and you're also very much absorbed by their thoughts. It's a very interesting experience. And this book is not only about the perception and assumption regarding relationships, like I just mentioned, it's also about memory and the malleable nature of memory, which definitely has a strong psychological basis. So in psychology, the subject of constructive memory and the reliability and malleability of memory is widely studied. And I feel like it also brings into question just how much of the way that we live our lives is actually a performance. Like the things that we say to people and the actions that we conduct in our daily lives, how much of that is us actually playing a role, and how the longer that you play a certain role, the more it becomes real, the more you kind of internalize a character that isn't actually yourself. And the further it goes on, the more it kind of blurs the edges of reality. And along those lines, it became a little bit surreal in part 2 of this story, where you really could no longer tell what's actually real. And because part 1 did such a great compelling job of letting you inhabit the protagonist's mind, in part 2 you really feel like you could no longer trust her mind. So because like certain contradictions with reality start appearing. I'm trying not to spoil this story. It is a quick read, and I do think it's a very entertaining read. And I do think this writer writes in a way where not a single sentence is wasted. Well, every sentence is a development or an escalation of what the previous sentence was talking about. And because of that, it's really easy to be absorbed into this story and just be carried along this flow of consciousness journey that at times is reminiscent of Virginia Woolf and also Franz Kafka, just due to how the plot developed in part 2. So overall, it is a surprising favorite for me, and I've definitely developed an interest in reading more from this author. The next few books I'm going to talk about I didn't enjoy as much, and one of them is Alien Clay by Adrian Tchaikovsky. In this story, Professor Arton Dadev is a political dissident of the Mandate that had taken over Earth, and because he is a member of the Resistance, he was exiled to an alien planet called Qiufan. And when he arrived at the labor camp that he was assigned to, he realized that there were alien ruins on this planet, and slowly he learns more about the local biology and how Qiufan biome has a highly symbiotic relationship, so multiple organisms can inhabit the same body and thrive together. And it leads to this kind of nightmarish creatures that look like different parts of multiple animals that are kind of Legoed together, and they look like something out of a child's nightmare. And there's also indication that currently human biology is still alien to the Qiufan biome, and they cannot simply inhabit the human body and form a seamless symbiosis. But with enough exposure, the Qiufan biome might decode human genetics and kind of incorporate human bodies into their symbiosis as well. I find the setting and premise of this story quite imaginative, and there are a few plot points that were exciting. However, this story is told from a first-person perspective, and the protagonist is very unlikable. So he is a professor, and he definitely has this intellectual exceptionalism, snobbishness that's dripping from his tone throughout the entire narration of the book. And also, he's sarcastic, but not funny sarcastic. It's rather a bitter sarcasm that made the story sound like you're listening to a snobbish uncle who loves the sound of his own voice a little bit too much. This narrative just felt really weighed down. Most of the first half of the book was just him running circles in his own mind, having dinners with the commandant of the camp, or arguing with the other prisoners, getting into fights, and it was 180 pages before he even went outside of the labor camp to actually observe the alien planet of Qiufan. I just feel like he could have touched alien grass a little bit sooner. And it was about 230 pages before he even went into one of those alien ruins that the author was kind of suspending our interest since the very beginning of the book. And after he went inside, the actual observation of what is inside the ruin was very brief, and you never really truly learn much about the civilization aspect of Qiufan. It's mostly the biome and the nightmarish nature of it that was portrayed. However, I really did enjoy reading part 3 of this story when everything took a really fundamental development and change. But getting to that good part was a real labor of patience. And at certain points, the language is so crass and casual that it just completely breaks immersion. Like in one scene, there was a researcher who was hitting a tree, and the author described it as going apeshit. And also, he very unironically used the word eat, like Y-E-E-T, to describe trying to get a slug away from him. So I do think there is a really good story at the heart of this book, but it really could have used a little bit more editing, more polish, and maybe just tightening up and trimming of the structure in general. Another disappointment this month was Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. This story is supposed to have elements of gothic fiction and space opera and grimdark fantasy and YA romance, and it lost me within part 1. The protagonist of this story, Gideon, is an orphan born to the 9th house. She is very skilled in wielding the sword, and she was forced to be a cavalier for the heir of the 9th house called Harrowhark. And together they travel to the planet of the 1st house to engage this very competitive, combative selection process to become the Emperor's lictor. So it's kind of like a battle royale situation, and halfway through the story it turned into a murder mystery. And it was not just that narrative focus shift that I did not like, it was mainly the dynamic between the two protagonists and the dialogue between them. So Gideon and Harrowhark really hate each other. So there's this really deep resentment between Gideon and Harrowhark, and most of the setup of this story was just these two teenagers who really hate each other, constantly bickering, trying to hurt each other. And the longer that goes on, the longer I just found myself pulling away from the the narrative and just really didn't want to listen anymore. And also it has that issue that Alien Clay has where there are certain spots where the language is so crass it just breaks immersion. Like right near the beginning, the Gideon experienced some like very unpleasant situation and she described it as a bag of ass. And she also described Harold Hark's lips as like puckered like a cat's ass. So it's just those things that just completely threw me off and just made me want to turn the book off. But while doing that, the author was also trying to use these like overly complex, sophisticated highbrow words like sotto voce or irascibly or corpuscular. So at one point I was wondering if a teenager wrote this while studying SAT vocabulary and just like gave up in parts of the story. So to be completely fair, the plot and the mystery did have a few like interesting, exciting spots, but also at the end when everything was explained, I felt like the character motivation was also not convincing. So overall, I didn't really enjoy the writing style and I really did not like the character dynamic, and the plot ended up being kind of unconvincing to me. So I don't think I will read 2 more books in this series, and unfortunately this was a disappointment for me. From the 2025 Booker Prize Longlist, I also read Universality by Natasha Brown and really did not enjoy it. In this story, someone was bludgeoned by a solid gold bar, and right at the beginning of the story, it tells you who did it. And then it just started following various characters that are involved in this event. One of them is the banker who owned the farm where this took place, and he is a rich, philandering man who couldn't stop cheating and having affairs. Another one is an anti-woke columnist who writes these like rage bait right-wing articles. And the group that were having a rave where this bludgeoning happened were the Universalists, who were kind of, I would say, middle-class kids trying to start their own commune because they were dissatisfied with capitalism. So basically all of the characters in this story are just characters and parodies of themselves, and in part 2 the story shifts to a journalist who was kind of freelancing and she had to take a second job to support her online shopping, Starbucks buying habits, and also cover rent. And she was lamenting how because she's white she doesn't have the identity for identity politics. And then the right-wing columnist performs fellatio on the banker. And I don't feel like there's a real plot to this story. Most of it is just either dialogue or monologue where the characters are kind of throwing talking points out without really adding anything to it. They would just list issues like classism, racism, identity politics, like I mentioned, and what they say is kind of just the equivalent of a series of rage bait tweets. So most of this book was just the author hitting the reader over the head with these empty, regurgitated talking points. It honestly felt like watching someone pull a piece of chewed gum out of their pocket and sticking it on the table and just making everyone feel bad for looking at it. So I do not recommend that you read this book, because if you've spent one day on Twitter or Reddit, you've heard everything that's in this story. And unfortunately, The South by Tash Aw was a DNF for me. So this story was set in the 90s in Malaysia, and it follows a boy called Jay who was traveling with his family to the South and to a farm that their family had inherited. So this was right after his grandfather passed away, and his mother never got along with his grandmother, so she wanted to give her space and really advocated for the family to take this trip. My main issue with this story is that it felt very rambling and aimless. Like the author was just including every action in pretty much every moment without really putting emphasis on anything and without really developing any of the characters in a way that would make me grow attached to them. And I can tell that he's trying to talk about issues of immigration and cultural identity, and like particularly like a Chinese cultural identity in a Malaysian context, and all of this like British influence, and also the coming of age process of this boy growing into a young man and faced with everyone else's concept and perception of masculinity, and also discovering that he's actually gay, so like coming to terms with his own sexual orientation. So all of these topics are very interesting, but I feel like the author like touches on them without really developing them very well and without actually weaving a compelling narrative that would keep me engaged. The narrative was just rambling from a bird is passing by or some fruits being dropped or these characters characters buying beer and then drinking beer and going fishing and cooking food. And sometimes you get glimpses of these issues through the dialogue between the characters. I do think that this author actually did a better job of incorporating these themes and issues into the plot compared to Universality by Natasha Brown, where talking points were just kind of thrown out in a very empty way. I feel like Tash Aw was actually incorporating these themes into the narrative. However, it's just so rambling and aimless, and I'm 50% throughout the story and I still don't really know what the goal of the story is. And this is a first installment in a planned quadrilogy. So I think because of that, I just don't see myself getting anywhere near the actual resolution of the story. I was slogging through just the first half of the first book. I really don't see myself reading 3 more, so I just don't think there is a point in me finishing the first story because I'm not sure if it will actually resolve or reach a conclusion. And if you've read this story and you disagree with me, maybe there's some dramatic turn in the second half of the story and I really should continue, please leave it in the comments below. But other than that, I don't really see myself finishing this story. So those were all of the books that I read in August. I definitely had some ups and downs this month. I feel like I read some of my favorite books of the year this month, and a few of these books really inspired me to read more and research further into the subjects that the author covered, and others ended up being disappointments. Overall, I hope you enjoyed this selection. I hope you enjoyed my reviews, and please let me know in the comments below what you read in August and what you thought of them. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.